Did you make New Year's resolutions for 2021? What were they? Were you planning to get more money, become healthier? By the way, how many have you broken already? Well, my resolution of eating more healthily didn't last long, but I know a lot of people are planning to make 2021 a great year, considering the challenges we had, how many opportunities were lost during 2020. So in today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, I've got two segments for you to help you, especially if you're interested in property investment. The main session, and it's a long one today, it's a detailed one today, is about gentrification, a way that if you understand how gentrification works and what to look for, your investments could outperform the market considerably because of the cycle of the suburb, not just the general property cycle. So we're going to go into that in a lot of detail. And I'm also going to, in my mindset message, ask you where you're going to be in 10 years' time. Because wherever that's going to be, you surely will be there. But are you deciding how you're going to get there and what you're going to do to make sure you end up in the right spot? Lots to talk about today to help make 2021 a better year for you in property. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Now, you've probably heard the term gentrification, and you may even have an understanding of what it means. But I wanted to devote this whole show of the Michael Yardney podcast to gentrification because once you better understand it, it represents a powerful opportunity for you to increase your property returns in the short term and also your overall real estate wealth in the long term. Now, let me explain how. I've discussed many times the fact that there's no such thing as one property market in Australia. In other words, there's multiple property markets. Each state's got its own market and each area has got different drivers and fundamentals. Within each state, there are their own property cycles, and interestingly, suburbs have their own cycles as well. Yes, there are suburbs going through different stages of their own property cycle. And those suburbs that are going through a growth phase are sometimes called gentrifying suburbs, which means they're going through a period of improvement and increased wealth. Now, many people misunderstand what gentrification really is. Getting an upgrade in infrastructure, getting a new Coles or a Bunnings or something like that, that's not gentrification. While it may improve the suburb, gentrification is something else altogether. It's when more affluent people move into the area. Now, I'm going to discuss that a bit in today's show, so please don't get offended when we talk about richer people, more affluent people, and average Australians or poorer people. This is not a judge of people, but it's a fact of life. As an investor, and for me as a property strategist, I look for areas that are going through gentrification because these suburbs have got their own cycle of growth independent of what's happening in the broader market. In general, capital growth in these areas are going to outperform the averages, and that's what we want, isn't it? These areas go from ugly ducklings to beautiful swans, and therefore homes in these suburbs increase in capital value much faster than the average for the state. As a property investor, if you can identify these type of locations, gentrifying locations, in the earlier stages of gentrification, and by while prices are more affordable, you stand to benefit from ongoing capital growth. But don't be too worried about timing it, right? I'll discuss it with you in a moment. And there are 6 stages of gentrification, and gentrification goes on over a number of decades. So timing isn't that critical with regard to gentrification. Okay, so how and why does gentrification happen? One of the most significant changes in the way we live in Australia over the last couple of decades is that our inner suburbs gentrified. That's probably something that you would recognise. When I was young, housing in the inner suburbs was cheap. They were where the working class and the migrants used to live. And these inner suburbs teemed with single-fronted cottages with pubs, but also with factories because people lived close to where they worked. But then within a few decades, the process of gentrification saw these ugly duckling suburbs transformed into graceful swans as higher income households displaced the blue-collar workers. And this changed the character of the neighbourhood. Interestingly, it also resulted in significant increase in property values. Think about it. If you've been around Australia for a while, you'd have seen the change in those inner suburbs a decade or two ago. So what caused this gentrification? Well, one of the main factors behind this revitalisation was the exodus of manufacturing from the inner, close to the port and close to the CBD suburbs, to the outer suburbs. Now, this was partly driven by cheaper transport, better road systems. At the same time, many migrant workers who lived in these inner suburbs departed to live in bigger, detached homes with front and backyards in the middle ring suburbs. Interestingly, around the same time, our society started to experience higher education levels. And this necessitated more people coming closer to the CBD, closer to the campuses, closer to the universities, close to where the jobs were, which were in general near the CBD. They made these working class suburbs, these older run-down suburbs, more desirable. The diversity of service-based jobs located close to the CBD, together with the increasing number of women in the workforce, declining household size, all made the prospect of living in those smaller properties near the city more attractive to a large cohort of potential buyers and also renters. Of course, it should come no surprise that this increasing demand led to house prices in the inner ring suburbs going up much faster than the outer suburbs. So how do you identify a suburb going through gentrification? Well, gentrification is a change in the fortunes of a suburb as it's discovered by a higher income demographic, and this slowly pushes the lower income residents out. The word gentrification comes from the Old English gentry. They were the more affluent people, and they move into an area. This usually occurs when working class people, tenants and migrants, move out as the space becomes too valuable, and the more affluent people move in. They renovate their old homes, they improve the surrounding shops. These new, more affluent residents, they invest time, money in improving the neighbourhood, and that in turn pushes up prices and rents. So back to my question, how do you spot a suburb that's in the process of going through this metamorphosis? One unusual and unexpected property research strategy that I read about was look at the dogs walking in the neighbourhood. Yeah, that's right. I said it. I suggest looking at the dog breeds for a sneaky clue. As I said, I read this fascinating article a little while ago that showed about the 3 stages of gentrification according to dog breeds. And I tell you what, they weren't wrong. Now, I'm going to give you more detailed way of finding gentrifying areas, but let's just have a light-hearted look at this. So in this article by Matt Holden in the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of years ago, the writer shared his view about gentrification, and let's, as I said, have a light-hearted look at it before we get into the heavier information in this long podcast. So what he said was there used to be 2 types of dogs prevalent hereabouts: short-haired, yappy, small things that belong to the old Anglo Aussies, and small fluffy yappy things that belong to old Greeks and Italians. You only knew these dogs existed when you ran up to the front gate and they yapped at you, unless you lived next door to one, in which case you heard them yapping all the time. And then he went on to say one of the first signs of gentrification was with the appearance of blue heelers riding shotgun in beaten-up utes driven by sculptors freshly graduated from art school. He said, that was a long time ago now, and the sculptors have grown up and moved back to the workshops in the outer urban factory belt, where their cattle dogs chase tiger snakes in the outer creek valleys. The second canine wave, he said, was the influx of dogs from young couples. Young couples bought dogs because they didn't have kids. Usually there was some whatever doodle, a practice dog for people who wanted to learn how to take responsibility for another creature before they actually had a human life dependent on them. And then the last of the 3 waves of gentrification in dogs was a result of property developers' vision. They're dogs who lived in dog box apartments. Hey, that's interesting, dog box apartments. He said there are dogs who live in dog box apartments, companion animals for young singles who can only probably barely take care of themselves. Now, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but in a few moments I'm going to share with you a more strategic approach to finding an gentrifying suburb, and I'll give you a bit of an example as well. But first, a note of the unintended impact that comes when a suburb goes through this form of gentrification transformation. See, the process of gentrification and prices rising has in the past blocked out a whole generation of younger people from inner city housing. It's made it too affordable, and it's likely the gap's only going to widen over the years. When a suburb's gentrifying and the area loses its stigma and more individuals on higher wages move in, this pushes up property prices further. It makes homes in the area even less affordable to the previous residents. Now, I'll leave the discussions about the remedy of this to town planners and politicians, but the truth is, unfortunately, gentrifying areas have become too expensive for a lot of people, but not at all expensive for those who want to and can afford to live there. But you've heard me say it before. There is a gap widening between these more affluent areas that are growing much faster than the poor areas. Anyway, homeowners and landlords, they take a different approach to each other. They've got different outcomes in mind. So the conclusion for property investors here is if you want to own the type of property that's going to outperform, the inner and the middle ring suburbs are the place that you should be looking at, not where the average investor looks. Looking back, one of the most significant transformations of our inner suburbs was how much household income grew, how different it grew as residents became better educated and had higher paying jobs. Unfortunately, it's a fact of life. The higher the education level you have, the more you're going to get paid over the period of your life, the more you're going to be able to afford to buy a property or rent in these types of areas. So 2-income households instead of one also meant that people had more money to spend on housing, and spend it they did. Now, I want to give you an example of a suburb that you may be familiar with, Redfern in New South Wales. Now, as I said a moment ago, gentrification occurred in those older working-class inner and port suburbs in many of our capital cities in the 90s and the 2000s. Now, think of Port Melbourne and St Kilda in Melbourne, Balmain and Redfern in Sydney. And a great example of the recent gentrifying suburb of Redfern in Sydney's inner city area was that, 20 years ago, Redfern was considered a seedy neighbourhood. Crime rates were high, unemployment levels amongst the residents was high, and it was generally considered, let's put it politely, a dodgy neighbourhood. Now, over time, that changed. Between 2010 and 2020, house prices in Redfern went up 273%, and apartment values in Redfern went up 204%. Let me repeat that. Over the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, according to CoreLogic, capital growth in Redfern, houses went up 273% and units 204%. So what happened during that time? Well, in reality, the process of gentrification started even earlier than that, perhaps a decade earlier. But as the suburb's proximity to the CBD and all the appealing local amenities drew a more affluent crowd to live there, the dynamics of the suburb evolved. The people moving into Redfern had better jobs, higher incomes, more employment stability. Stats from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research released in 2010 revealed that in the 2 years to September 2009, robbery without a weapon dropped 27%. So in the beginning, in the first decade of gentrification of Redfern, robbery without a weapon dropped 27.6%, robbery with a weapon and not a firearm dropped 48%, motor vehicle theft fell 29%, and stealing from a person dropped 36%. Overall, the suburbs started to move up, and those who bought in the area during that gentrifying period benefited many times over. Back to the question I've asked a couple of times, what's the key to identifying a gentrifying location, one where property values are going to increase above average? So we're not just counting on the general property market, we're not just counting on the cycle of the state, but we're counting on the cycle of the suburb that's got its own life. So, first of all, you need to find suburbs where incomes are growing, where increasingly people's ability to afford to pay higher prices and higher rents is therefore increasing as well. Now, you can dig into the census. That actually shows wages growth in all suburbs. And we know that wages growth's been pretty low in the last year or so and is likely to remain that way for a while. But that's average wages growth. And over the last census period, in some suburbs, wages have grown 20 to 30% more than the state's average. You're likely to find that these suburbs are the home of a number of other identifying features of gentrification. You're going to find that top-end cafes turn up there, that restaurants are there, as well as higher-end stores where the wealthier people can and do spend their money. Because generally, that's what they do. Not surprisingly, household sizes tend to be smaller in those locations, with more interest from empty nesters, from young professionals, and from what's called dinks. Double income, no kids. Now, the secret to identifying gentrification involves researching locations where a number of economic factors are changing at the same time. Now, to make things clear, just because some suburbs are cheap doesn't mean they're destined to become the next growth area, doesn't mean they're destined to gentrify. Some suburbs are inexpensive for a reason. They're not going to improve because of various socio-economic factors. There may be too much industry there, there could be a lot of social or public housing, or possibly ongoing crime, drugs, gang problems. Or they may be in those outer-lying suburbs with poor infrastructure, poor facilities, lack of public transport, and little prospect of change in the medium term. On the other hand, the type of suburb to look for is one that's relatively cheap today, but has the potential for future capital growth. Some of the major drivers of capital growth are, as I've already mentioned, proximity to the CBD, closeness to the water. We're going to appreciate that. Post-COVID, we're going to need neighbourhoods that are going to give us lifestyle, desirability, amenity. So we look for suburbs that are close to more expensive neighbourhoods so they can benefit from the ripple effects. You know how one suburb does well and then the adjoining suburb is so much cheaper, so it suddenly gets pulled up as well. You can also look for desirable amenities such as good public transport, a large shopping centre, or the catchment of highly prized public schools. Often you're going to find older, attractive houses with character features, but that are getting past their use-by date, that are ready to be renovated. And also, you can look for areas where governments are investing in local infrastructure or beautification programs. So now, once you've got the big picture, you've got to start doing some research at the micro level. So what do you look for in the suburb? Some of the steps you can take to find the suburb that's improving is go for a drive or go for a walk. And you'll know it when you see it because you'll find evidence of people with money moving in. They're going to be spending large amounts of money renovating their properties or extending their homes. There's going to be lots of white. They're now the new black SUVs parked in the driveways rather than the old Ford Falcons or the Holden Utes. The nature of the shops are going to be changing. There's going to be gyms there, but they're going to be offering Pilates. The cafes are going to sell cold-pressed coffee. The delis are going to serve goat's cheese pizza. Gentrifying suburbs will, in general, be in the inner and middle ring suburbs of our capital cities, where people of a higher social status want to live. Now, remember, this is not a judge of people, but people with a higher education level and who earn more are going to want to associate with other people who are similar to that, and they're going to want to all live in the same areas. So as a property investor, if you can pick an area going through gentrification, one that's shifting from dreary to in demand, you stand to benefit from this accelerated growth. And as I said at the beginning, you don't need to get your timing perfect. The gentrification process lasts a number of decades. In fact, it goes through 6 stages. It's the rebirth of these suburbs that takes time and goes through specific stages. Now, I'm not talking about hotspots. I'm not talking about the quick short-term trends that come and go. I'm talking about long-term trends where more affluent people move into an area and change the nature of it. So gentrification goes through 6 stages, and they're probably a bit too much detail to go in this podcast, but I've written a very detailed article on Property Update about this going through the various stages, and that's what my team at Metropole do a lot of research in, to find which of the stages of gentrification a suburb is in when we start looking for where to invest. So I'm going to leave a link in the show notes where you can read a lot more about gentrification as well as the 6 stages. But remember, location does 80% of the heavy lifting of the capital growth of your investment property. And so for you to find a property that's going to outperform the averages, have a look at areas that are gentrifying. And then why not be part of that gentrification by adding value, by increasing tenant appeal, by increasing the rent, by renovating or redeveloping your properties. That's what I've done for a long time. And I've been doing it in the middle ring suburbs where I pull down old houses and build 2 townhouses. So lots of new development going on in some of these gentrifying areas. However, one of the mistakes I've seen investors make is buying a property to renovate in an area that isn't exhibiting strong long-term growth, that isn't gentrifying. In other words, they're fighting the trend. It's hard to add significant value where the area in general isn't growing well. Sure, you may make a one-off financial gain by manufacturing some extra value. It may make it more appealing for tenants. You may get a little bit of better rent. But if the location isn't growing in value strongly, if the area is not gentrifying, then you're not getting the same multiplier effect that's going to ensure that your property increases in capital growth and rental value well beyond the average for many years. So to make things 100% crystal clear, gentrification is about people, not about property. It's a trend that aspirational people of higher socioeconomic status move into a neighbourhood and transform it. So if you want to own the sort of property that's going to outperform the averages, if you want to profit from gentrification, it's this inner sanctum of suburbs that are the place that you should be investing in. They're what I call destination suburbs, a location where people want to go and want to be seen. That's where there's lots of things to do locally. The locals don't want to travel far. They don't want to, especially post-COVID, they recognise the importance of neighbourhood and they want everything to be within 20 minutes of where they live. They also like to live in suburbs that have got a sort of brand image, where the image is strong, where the vibe and the action is. They like to show the latte they bought in the local cafe on Instagram or on Facebook. I mean, think about Bondi. People want to go there for the lifestyle and to do things. They can go to the beach, they can go to the cafes, they can buy a Bondi burger. They're happy to be associated with the Bondi brand. There's even a TV show about it, isn't there? Bondi Vet, Bondi Surf Rescue. Now, Bondi's not the only suburb that's got a brand, that's got a destination that people aspire to go to, but they're the sort of suburbs you should look at. Think of Elwood in Melbourne, Tenerife in Brisbane, Braden in the ACT. So I've rambled on about gentrification a bit, but what I'm trying to show you is that if you choose a suburb that's going through gentrification, it's one of the strategies that we use at Metropole to outperform the market. The system we use has helped many of our clients build substantial property portfolios because we use a top-down approach. We go from the macro to the micro. It starts with examining the macro factors affecting our property market and then drills down to the micro factors. So we look at the big picture, the macroeconomic environment. We look for the right state to invest, one that's going to outperform because of its economic growth, creating jobs growth. People are going to want to move there. People are going to earn more. And that's population growth, and wages growth is what pushes up property values. But then within that state, we're looking for the right suburbs that are going to outperform. And gentrification is one of the factors that we look for. By no means the only factor. As I said at the beginning, we found some suburbs outperform 50 to 100% more with regard to capital growth over a 10-year period. And remember, it's not just the owner-occupiers in those suburbs where their values go up, but the tenants have chosen to live there because of the lifestyle. Not all tenants rent because they can't afford to buy. Sure, a lot do, but they're not the tenants that I'm looking for because it's going to be really hard to push up their rents over time. I'm looking for tenants who choose to live in an area because of the lifestyle of that location. So they're the sort of suburbs that we target. And as I said, often they're gentrifying. As I said a few times, it's all about demographics. And these areas are where there's going to be more owner-occupiers also wanting to live because of lifestyle and where they're prepared to. But just as importantly, they can afford to pay a premium to live there because they've got the high disposable incomes. And it occasionally happens further out, but almost always it's in the inner and middle ring suburbs of our big capital cities. And that's the same all over the world. The wealthy tend to live close to the CBD or close to the water. Now, why? Well, you may say, because they can afford to, and that's partly true, but they don't like to travel either. They want to be where all those established amenities are. So once we found that location, we look for the right location within that suburb. You know yourself in your own suburb that not all parts of the suburb are the same. We look for livable streets that are going to outperform the other streets. We're looking for the right property in the right location with the desirable features that's going to be an investment grade property. And then we look at the price. Price is right down the bottom. You're not going to find in these sort of areas, in the current market, a bargain. There's owner-occupiers that are going to compete with you, and there's other smart investors who are going to compete with you as well. But you're going to outperform in the long term, not because you buy your property cheaply, but because you buy the right property. So what we look for are properties with owner-occupier appeal. We look to buy below intrinsic value. We look to buy properties that have got a high land to asset ratio because in those areas the land is desirable. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a big block of land, and it doesn't necessarily mean a house or a semi or a townhouse or a villa unit, because there's some great older Art Deco or character apartments, or what we used to be called flats, in the inner suburbs, particularly in Sydney, but also a little bit in Melbourne, in these gentrifying areas. So not the new apartments where that's changing the area, but we also look for properties with a twist, something unique, something special, something different, something scarce about it. And I like manufacturing capital growth. So while the area's outperforming, I also like to create some capital growth by refurbishment, by renovations, by development. And if we do get an area which is already growing itself quickly, the market's going to do some of the heavy lifting and I'm going to do the rest. So by following this approach, you minimize your risks and you maximize your upside. Each strand of my approach actually helps make money, and combining all of them together puts the odds in your favor. And that's what our team at Metropole does. We make sure that we do the homework and the research to know which areas to look for. We know what properties to buy. Some of them, even in today's market, we're getting off market. So my suggestion is, if you want to outperform the markets as we're moving into the new property cycle, why not level the playing field and get my team at Metropole on your side? Can you afford to make a mistake in these challenging times? We'll give you direction, we'll give you certainty. Hey, but we got no properties for sale. And it always starts by putting together a strategic property plan, a personalised plan for you, so you can plan to become the person you plan to become. So you can trust my team at Metropole to provide direction, guidance and results. Why not go to metropole.com.au and find out about what we do. We give strategic property advice. We have a buyer's agency, wealth advisory, financial planning, property management, renovations, development. You can choose some of those services, or all of them. Metropole.com.au or 1300 Metropole, and we'll help you put a lot of this that I've just explained to you into place to help you outperform the averages.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? That's the topic of my mindset message today. And that's a good question to ask yourself at the start of a new year, isn't it? Where are you going? Because you know what? 10 years from now, you're surely going to arrive. But the question is, where? And we don't want to kid ourselves about that. We don't want to kid ourselves about the road we're walking. I learned a lesson from one of my mentors that I quote often in this podcast, Jim Rohn, who said that at the age of 25, shortly after meeting his mentor, Earl Shoaff, that was the name of his mentor, he had a day called Don't Kid Myself Anymore Day. He said, I didn't want to be disillusioned anymore. He said, I finally decided that crossed finger theory wasn't the way to get me what I wanted. It wasn't where the treasure lies. Jim Rohn said, I was going to have to make sure which way I was headed. And then he went on to say, then, with the help of his mentor, Mr. Shoaff, I found a few reading disciplines, a few disciplines of the mind, and a few disciplines of activity that, when exercised, can make all the differences to the world to where you'll arrive. But it took a few changes. And similarly, if you're going to want to arrive in a different spot in 10 years' time, you're going to have to change how you think, what you do, what you read, who you listen to, who your mentors are. Anyway, back to what Jim Rohn said. He said, sometimes we get the idea that we're doing 10% and there's 90% more that we need to do to make a difference to your fortune, but probably the opposite's true. Jim Rohn said we're doing enough of those things to have bought and shared in the good life. And maybe we just need an extra 5% or 10% of intellectual activity change, refinement of discipline, refinement of thought. And all we need is the idea to make those simple changes. And suddenly the equity starts gathering in 1 year, 3 years, 5 and 10 years. But now's the time to fix the next 10 years, said Jim Rohn. You have to come to grips with reality. And that's what happened to him when he met his mentor. He said he was 25 years old and his mentor was 44 years old. And he said, my mentor, Mr. Shoaff, brought me a wealth of experience. And he started by asking me the tough questions, big questions. He asked, are you reading the books that are going to take you to where you want to be in the next 5 years of your life? Now, that's a good question, isn't it? What are you reading? Who are you listening to? In those days, there wasn't podcasts, there wasn't YouTube, but there's so many wrong things. There are so many misleading things out there. So the same question you should be asking yourself, what are you reading? What are you taking in to feed your mind to make sure you're in the right spot in 10 years' time? Because to get where you want to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, you're either going to be reading the right books or not. You're going to be listening to the right podcasts or not. You're going to be watching the right YouTube videos or reading the right blogs or not. You're either engaged in the disciplines or you're not. But here's what you don't want to engage in. Disillusion. Hoping without acting. Wishing without doing. So the key message I want to give you today is to ask yourself, where am I? What could I do to make the change to ensure that I could be more certainly stepping day by day to the treasure I want, to the mental treasure, to the personal treasure, to the spiritual treasure, to the financial treasure? You should be saying to yourself, I don't want to make errors anymore. Now's the time to adjust my daily program to take me to where I want to go. So the key is to start right now by making the change to walk along this new road in this new year. Just a few daily disciplines will make a big difference. You only have to change a few things, and before you know it, you'll be walking down a brand new road. I wonder where you're going to be in 10 years' time. Well, thanks for spending the time with me today. I hope you got some benefit understanding the importance of choosing the right location and, if possible, one that's gentrifying to help your property investments outperform the averages. Now, during the month of January, we're going to be running 3 podcasts a week rather than my twice-a-week show, because we're going to bring back in our summer series some of the old podcasts that I've run before. But if you've got extra time over summer, why not go into Apple Podcasts or whichever podcast app you're listening to this on and go back to some of the old shows. Listen to them at 1.5, 2 times speed. I still make sense. By the way, that's how I listen to podcasts. In between, you can catch me on social media, and my Property Update newsletter is still coming out every day. By the way, if you haven't joined the Property Update Facebook group, why not join that now too? Just do a search for it on Facebook, because I regularly leave exclusive content there for people who are interested in property. If you got some benefit from today's show, I'd really appreciate you telling somebody about it. Let's make this a year where lots more people become financially independent, lots more people become financially affluent. So share it with somebody, use the podcast share button on your app, or leave a message on iTunes or Stitcher or Apple Podcast, wherever you listen to this. In the meantime, I'll be back, as I said, in January 3 times a week, or you can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney. Have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?